The sound of her screaming is the first thing I remember from that night, and the last thing I will ever forget as long as I live. It cut through the dark like a knife,
Isaiah.
high and raw
now.
and broken, tearing across the cotton fields and slipping under the door of every cabin in the quarters. I had heard my wife cry before. I had heard her sob into her hands, heard her choke on her own breath trying not to wake me. But this was different. This was the sound of something inside a person being torn out by the root. I was standing outside the master's house when it began, my hands wrapped around the worn wooden handle of a hoe. I had no reason to be holding it that hour, except that I could not stand to look at my own empty hand. My fingers were clenched so tight that the skin split along the knuckles, and I did not feel it until I saw the drops of blood dripping onto the dust at my feet. Above me, the big White House rose up against the night like a ghost. Every window dark except one, that square of yellow light on the second floor where my wife was. The air smelled like heat and sweat and old smoke from the cooking fires. The stars were sharp and cold overhead, 1,000 eyes watching and doing nothing. The crickets had been singing a moment before, that low buzzing sound that fills a Mississippi night, but even they seemed to fall silent when she screamed again. I remember thinking how strange it was that the whole world could hear that kind of pain and still just keep spinning, like nothing was happening at all. My name is Isaiah Cole. I was 35 years old that night. I had been a slave on Whitfield Plantation for 22 of those years, longer than some of the trees had been standing in the front yard. I knew every rut in the road, and every nail in the barn door, every knot in the fence posts, and every creak in the floorboards of my own cabin. I knew exactly how many steps it took to walk from the quarters to the fields, from the fields to the whipping post, from the whipping post to the big house. I had worn those paths into the earth with my feet until they felt like grooves carved into my bones. I also knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that there were places my feet were not meant to go. A slave might walk past the big house. A slave might be summoned to the kitchen, to the back porch, to the stables, even to the front steps if the master wanted someone to hold his horse. But there were lines, invisible but sharp as barbed wire, that we were never meant to cross. The front door of that house might as well have been the gate to another world. That night, I stood just outside its circle of power, close enough to see the cracks in the white paint on the columns, far enough away to remind myself that I did not belong. Inside those walls, my wife was alone with him. Her name is Ruth. I say is, not was, because to me she is still that woman I married in the shadows under the old pecan tree. Even though the world tried its best to grind her into dust, she had a laugh that came from deep in her chest, like it had to fight its way through all the sadness first, before it could reach her mouth. She used to laugh a lot, back when we still believed there was something ahead of us besides work and pain and an unmarked grave. Back when the future was something we could talk about without feeling foolish. We jumped the broom 12 years before that night, with 3 other couples and an old woman humming low in the background. No preacher, no Bible, no papers, but it was real to us. I remember how Ruth's hand trembled in mine, and how her eyes shone in the dark, full of a kind of quiet hope I could hardly bear to look at. We whispered about children, about a little patch of land somewhere far from the reach of men like Master Whitfield, about a life where we could sleep without listening for footsteps on the path outside our door. That life never came. Instead, Master Whitfield's eye fell on her. At first, it was just the way he looked at her when he rode past the fields. He had pale gray eyes that never seemed to warm, not even when he smiled. I noticed how those eyes lingered on Ruth a little longer than they did on the other. How he started calling her up to the house to help with small chores, polishing silver, sweeping the hall, carrying trays, things he never bothered with before. At night, when she came back to the cabin, she would say very little, but she would stand at the wash basin and scrub her hands until the skin turned raw. The first time he took her, I was not there. I was in the far field, picking cotton under a sun that felt like an iron pressing down on the back of my neck. I remember staring at the white bowls until my eyes blurred, thinking only about making it through another row, another hour, another day. When I came back to the quarters, the other men looked at me in a way that made my stomach turn. No one wanted to speak, but no one could quite meet my eyes. I knew something was wrong before I even reached my cabin door. Ruth was sitting on the floor when I walked in, not on the bed, not at the table, just on the boards with her knees pulled up to her chest. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. There was a red mark blooming across her cheek like someone had pressed a hot iron there and then taken it away. She would not look at me. When I knelt beside her and tried to touch her, she flinched like my hand was a whip. I do not need to tell you every word she said to me when she finally spoke. Some things belong between a husband and a wife, even when the world has done its best to strip them of everything else. I will only say this. There are hurts a body can take and heal from, scars that fade beneath others. But there are some wounds a person carries on the inside that never close, that never stop bleeding. What Master Whitfield did to my wife that day was a wound like that. For a long time after, I told myself I could live with it, not because it didn't matter, but because every path I could see ended in my death and her being sold away. I had seen men hanged for less. I had watched them swing from trees at the edge of the property. Their bodies left for days so the crows could take their eyes while we were marched past, forced to look. I knew exactly what kind of lesson Master Whitfield liked to teach, so I did what a slave was meant to do. I bent my head. I said, "Yes, Master," and "No, Master," and "Thank you, Master," with a tongue that tasted like ashes. I went to the fields each morning and came back each night, and in between I tried not to think about the times. Ruth did not come back at all until long after dark. When she did return, she lay on the bed with her back to me, her breathing slow and steady like she was afraid if she broke the rhythm, everything inside her would shatter. I thought if I could keep my head low enough, if I could make myself small enough, the storm might pass over us. Men like Whitfield like to take their pleasure and then grow bored, moving on to some new cruelty. I prayed for his boredom like other men pray for rain. Instead, he grew fond of his visits. Twice a week at first, then 3 times. Then whenever his temper was bad, or his drink ran low, or the weather turned, and he had nothing else to do. Year by year, I watched that quiet hope die in Ruth's eyes. It is a terrible thing, watching the person you love fade while they are still breathing next to you. That night, when her scream tore across the yard, I knew something had changed. This was not the muffled sob of a woman trying not to wake her husband on the other side of a thin wall. This was terror-scraped raw. This was the sound of someone who had reached the edge of what they could endure. My feet moved before my mind made any decision. One moment I was standing in the shadows near the steps, the hoe handle slick with sweat and blood in my hand. The next I was closer, close enough to see the front door clearly, close enough to smell pipe smoke and spilled whiskey drifting out of an open window. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs from the inside. Every rule I had ever learned shouted at me to turn around, to walk back down that path, to go to my cabin and shut the door and pretend I had heard nothing. But rules are chains just like iron, manacles are chains. And there comes a moment, if you pull on a chain long enough, when it either breaks or you do. Another scream tore through the house. It sounded like my name was buried in it. That was when something inside me snapped. I wish I could tell you. I took a deep breath and made a brave decision like the heroes in the stories folks tell now. The truth is messier than that. My legs were shaking, my mouth was dry. I could barely see straight from the fear and the rage tangled up together in my chest. But for the first time in my life, the fear was not the strongest thing in me. I stepped forward, up onto the first stair of the place I was never meant to stand, my hand still wrapped around that hoe handle like it was the only thing tethering me to the earth. Every board creaked under my weight, like it was shouting my crime to the night. On the second floor, behind that square of yellow light, my wife was screaming. And I knew, as sure as I knew the scars on my own back, that before the sun rose on Whitfield Plantation, something here was going to burn, me, him, or the whole damn place. Before the blood and the fire, before the night my world split open, Whitfield Plantation looked like any other proud southern estate, at least to someone standing on the outside of its gate. Travelers passing down the long red dirt road would slow their horses to admire the great oak trees lining the main path, branches heavy with Spanish moss like nature's own silk curtain. They would marvel at the white-pillared mansion sitting high on its hill, with its wraparound porch and tall windows glowing warm in the evening. They saw paintings of gentility, a world of manners and tradition, where the master read newspapers on the veranda and the mistress hosted tea parties in the parlor. But the truth of Whitfield lived in the shadows, behind the tobacco barns, the fields that stretched for miles, and the cabins crowded with bodies in quiet suffering. Visitors didn't see the broken tools we hid under loose floorboards, or the tears mothers cried over children sold to pay the master's gambling debts. They didn't see the way we walked with our heads low, not out of humility but self-preservation. They didn't hear the echo of the whip cracking at dawn, or the muffled sobs rising from the quarters at night. I had been on Whitfield Plantation since my 13th year. The memory of my mother being sold away outside the Charleston auction house still lives in me like a rusted knife. My father died of fever the year after we were brought here, leaving me alone but for the other field slaves who helped raise me. When you are a child in chains, family is not blood. It is survival, and survival is shared in whispers and quiet hands helping you to your feet. By the time I was grown, I knew every inch of that land. The cotton fields ran like pale rivers through the property, wide, endless, and merciless in the sunlight. Tobacco plants stood tall in the backfields, their sticky leaves clinging to the skin as we harvested them. The sugar house, used more for storage than actual refining, always smelled of old molasses and damp wood. The overseer's shed beside the training pen carried a scent of leather, sweat, and something darker, something metallic and permanent. Our cabins stood in 2 long rows near the tree line. Each one held 2 families, sometimes 3. The boards in the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor breathing at night. The floors were packed dirt, smoothed down by footsteps and tears and time. We had iron pots for cooking, straw pallets for sleeping, and a fireplace that barely kept the cold away in winter. But that cabin was ours. In a world built to break us, that small room with its cracked window and creaking door was a place where we could whisper to one another and believe, even for a moment, that we were human. That is where I first saw Ruth. She came to Whitfield 6 years after I did, brought from an estate in Natchez after the mistress there died, and the master sold off his excess stock. I remember the first time I saw her. She was standing with her hands clasped in front of her, shoulders drawn tight, eyes scanning the yard with the look of a deer trapped between hunters. Her dress was faded blue, worn thin at the elbows, but her posture had a quiet strength to it. Not defiance, just a refusal to collapse. Old Lottie, one of the quarter mothers, nudged me and whispered, "That girl got a voice like spring water when she sings." I didn't believe her until I heard it for myself. Music on a plantation is a strange thing. Sometimes it is sorrow wrapped in melody. Sometimes it is the only way a person can say the things no one else is allowed to hear. Ruth didn't sing often, only when she thought no one was listening. But her voice carried truth the way the river carries reflections of the moon. It was gentle but sure, soft but steady. It made me feel like the world had not swallowed all its light. We grew close in the way people do when the world gives them nothing but each other. We would talk in the evenings after work, sitting side by side on the porch steps of the cabin. She told me she had a younger brother, sold away at 12, and she still dreamed of finding him one day. I told her I wanted to see snow just once in my life, real snow like they have in the north. We talked about names for children we weren't allowed to have. We talked about freedom, the way starving men talk about bread, hungrily but without hope. The night we jumped the broom, it was as though all the suffering in our past fell away for a moment. Old Lottie swept the dirt floor clean, humming low in her throat. The men held up lanterns to light the ceremony. Someone brought a scrap of red cloth and tied it around Ruth's wrist. A symbol of protection, though none of us could protect her from the world outside those walls. When we jumped over that broomstick hand in hand, a cheer went up from the others. It was the sound of people celebrating something the law refused to acknowledge. Our love, our bond, our humanity. We lived as husband and wife. Though our marriage was not legal, we made a home in that cabin, small as it was. We whispered dreams about freedom like prayers. We didn't dare speak too loud. We hoped for children and dreaded them in the same breath. For what parent wants to bring a child into chains? For years our life moved in a steady rhythm. Work, rest, whispered dreams. Shared meals of salted pork and cornbread, songs carried quietly through the night. Hard, yes, painful often, but together, then Master Whitfield's eye fell on her. He was a man of maybe 40, tall, handsome in the way cruel men sometimes are. He dressed in crisp linen and kept his boots polished to a shine. He spoke softly most of the time, almost gently, and that made his cruelty worse. A man who screams when he beats you is one kind of evil. A man who whispers while he destroys you is another. At first it was nothing more than a lingering look, then a request for Ruth to come help with polishing silver, then to clean the parlor, then to serve tea when guests came. I felt it before I saw it, a coldness creeping into our cabin each night, a silence that stretched wider and heavier than it ever had before. Ruth would sit on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped, hands clenched tightly together, but she said nothing. When I tried to ask, she shook her head, eyes shining with tears she refused to shed. The first time he took her was on a night when thunder rumbled a warning through the hills. Lightning cracked across the sky, but no storm outside matched the storm inside that big white house. Ruth returned long after the rest of us had gone to our cabins. She walked like her feet hurt with every step. Her dress was wrinkled, torn slightly at the seam. She sat down on the floor and didn't move for a long while. When she finally spoke, her voice was tiny, like a child's. "He called me to the study," she whispered. "I tried to leave. He said I didn't have a say." Her voice broke then, and something broke inside me with it. But I held her. I told her we would endure, that as long as we had each other, we could survive anything. I said those words because I needed to believe them. But each day after that became harder. Each time she left the cabin for the big house, I stood in the doorway and watched her walk down that path with a dread so heavy it felt like chains dragging me into the earth. And she changed, the way people do when a piece of them is stolen. The laughter stopped. The hope in her eyes dimmed like a lantern running out of oil. She stopped talking about her brother. She stopped humming while she cooked. She stopped looking at me when she spoke. What does a man do when he watches the woman he loves fade like a ghost before his eyes? Most men have choices. I did not. Because on a plantation, a man could love, but he could not protect. Not until the night I decided the price of silence was too high. Not until the night fire felt like the only way to breathe again. There are moments in a man's life when he learns exactly what he is worth in the eyes of the world. For most men, that truth comes slow, through disappointments, through failures, through the quiet erosion of dreams. But for a slave, that truth is given violently, like a slap across the face. It arrives in one blow, one command, one moment when you are forced to understand that your life, your body, your wife, your future all belong to someone else. The first time Ruth returned from the big house after Whitfield laid hands on her, I understood what the world thought of me, and what it thought of her. We were property, tools, breeding stock, bodies to be used until they broke. But understanding something does not mean accepting it. In the weeks that followed that first night, the plantation moved around us as though nothing had changed. The fields still needed tending. The cotton still needed picking. Dawn still came dragging us from our pallets with its cold, pale light. Overseer Graham still walked the rows with his whip coiled in his hand like a snake waiting to strike. The sun still burned our backs until sweat stung every cut and blister. Life on Whitfield Plantation did not pause for anyone's suffering. It swallowed it whole. But inside me, something had shifted. Every morning I rose from that narrow bed and pretended nothing had happened. I walked to the fields. I bent my back to the cotton. I answered yes, sir, and no, sir, with steady calm, as though my world had not been ripped to pieces. The other slaves pretended too. They spoke to me gently, kindly, but with an edge of pity that made my skin crawl. A man can endure hunger, pain, and cold. But pity is a wound that bleeds on the inside. Some tried to help in their own quiet ways. Old Isaac would bring Ruth extra rations when the master kept her late. Lottie whispered prayers for her in the night, hands gripping the quilt as though she could shield Ruth with faith alone. Even the children, too young to fully understand, moved out of her way in silence when she walked past. But there is no kindness strong enough to heal the kind of hurt Whitfield carved into her. Ruth tried to hide it at first, tried to bury the worst of it inside herself, like a secret too heavy to carry in the open. But the changes came anyway, slowly at first and then all at once, like a river overflowing after too many storms. She stopped humming. She stopped laughing. She stopped touching me. Some nights she lay stiff beside me, her back to my chest, her breathing tight and shallow like she was trying not to exist. Other nights she wouldn't lie down at all. She sat on the edge of the bed until dawn, her eyes staring at nothing, her hands gripping her own arms like she was holding herself together. I tried everything I could think of. I told her stories about escape, stories I barely believed anymore. I whispered to her about cold rivers in the north, about towns where colored people walked free, earned wages, chose their own future. I repeated the tales Benjamin had told us about Harriet Tubman, about brave souls who followed the North Star to a freedom promised only in whispers. But Ruth only nodded. She never looked at me when I spoke. It was as though she had one foot in another world, a place where neither my voice nor her own could reach. And then Whitfield began calling for her regularly, twice a week at first, then 3 times, then whenever he pleased, and always at night. Always when the quarters were quiet and dark, and everyone could hear the soft, quick footsteps of a woman walking toward her own torment. Graham would come to our cabin door, tapping lightly with the back of his knuckles, a polite gesture that made my stomach twist. He'd speak in a low, almost apologetic voice. "Master wants Ruth." He never said why. He never needed to. We all knew. The first few times, Ruth would look at me before she left, fear trembling in her eyes like a candle flame in a storm. She would open her mouth as if to speak, then close it again. No words were big enough to carry the truth between us. I would squeeze her hand. She would squeeze mine back. And then she would step into the night, and the door would close behind her like a final heartbeat. After a while, she stopped looking back. After a while, she stopped squeezing my hand. After a while, she simply rose when Graham knocked, walked past me with her head down, and disappeared into the darkness. To survive as a slave, you must learn to live inside yourself, because you cannot live inside the world. I tried to bury the pain deep, to swallow it like poison in hope it killed only the parts of me that hurt. But the poison didn't stay where I put it. It seeped into everything. My work, my sleep, my thoughts. I began waking in the night with my fists clenched, nails cutting into my palms. I began grinding my teeth until my jaw ached. I began feeling a heat behind my eyes that I had no name for then, though I know now what it was. Rage, not the sharp, fast kind that makes a man throw punches. No, this was slow, heavy. It sat in my chest like a burning coal, glowing a little brighter each time Ruth returned to the cabin with her shoulders slumped and her face turned away from the light. Men tried to warn me. Old Benjamin pulled me aside one morning while we bent over the cotton rows. He had lived long enough to see too much. His voice was low, but the truth in it hit like a hammer. Don't go getting yourself killed over what you can't change. Master takes what he wants, always has, always will. You fight that, you die, and she gets sold downriver for the trouble. I knew he was right. Every slave on Whitfield's land carried scars from lessons just like that. But some wounds run deeper than scars. The worst of it wasn't the nights she didn't come back until morning. It wasn't the bruises on her arms, or the tremble in her voice, or the way she flinched when someone walked too close behind her. The worst of it was watching her disappear while still sitting in front of me. Watching the hope drain from her like water, leaking from cupped hands. Watching the woman I loved turn into a ghost. That kind of pain does not stay quiet forever. There is a point. Every man reaches it. When the hurt becomes too heavy to hold, when silence becomes impossible, when obedience becomes poison, when the weight of being alive feels like chains on chains on chains. I reached that point the night I found Ruth sitting on the edge of the bed, her dress torn at the shoulder, her hair undone, her breathing ragged like she had run a long way. Though she'd only walked across the yard, she would not speak, she would not meet my eyes. She sat there shaking, her fingers digging into her own arms until crescent moons of blood formed beneath her nails. I walked toward her slowly, as though any sudden movement might cause her to shatter. I knelt beside her. I reached for her hands. She pulled them away. "Ruth," I whispered, "talk to me." She shook her head. "Please," I said, "tell me what happened." She closed her eyes. Tears slid down her cheeks like something that had finally given up holding on. He said, her voice cracked. She swallowed. He said, "If I screamed again, he'd cut your tongue out and hang you by your wrists until you died slow." My vision went black around the edges. I couldn't breathe. But the worst part wasn't what Whitfield had done. It was what Ruth said next, her voice barely more than a breath. I can't keep living like this." Something inside me, something buried deep for years, started to move. It was small at first, like a spark blown by the wind. But it grew, it spread. It warmed the cold parts of me. It burned through the fear, through the silence, through the rules I had lived my whole life by. I didn't know it then, not fully. But that was the night I stopped being afraid of dying and started being afraid of living one more day like this. I didn't speak that truth out loud. Not yet, not while Ruth was trembling beside me. I held her until she fell asleep, her breath quiet and broken against my chest. I listened to the night outside, to the wind passing through the trees, to the distant bark of dogs, to the crackle of the lantern fire as it burned low. And somewhere in the dark, beneath the sorrow, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the centuries of chains, a single thought rose inside me like a whisper from a deeper place. This cannot go on. And in that whisper, quiet as a heartbeat, I felt the first stirrings of the fire that would one day consume everything Whitfield ever built. There are nights that enter a man's memory like a brand seared into flesh, hot, permanent, impossible to forget even if he tried. The night I told Master Whitfield no was one of those nights. I can still feel the air from that evening if I close my eyes. Thick with humidity, buzzing with crickets, taste of dust on my tongue, the faint smell of rain drifting from somewhere far off. Everything felt too still, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed, elbows on my knees, staring at the door as though I could will it to stay shut. Ruth was beside me, her hands folded in her lap, fingers twisting together over and over like they were trying to braid themselves into something strong enough to keep her standing. The lantern cast a soft yellow glow over her face, and I could see she hadn't stopped shaking since the moment she told me what Whitfield had threatened. It was the kind of trembling that starts deep inside a person, like the ground under her feet was crumbling away grain by grain. She had barely spoken a word since, and I didn't know what to say either. What can a man say when he knows someone else owns his wife's body and can do what he wants with it? Words felt small, too small for the weight pressing down on my chest. The quiet inside the cabin was broken by a faint echo from the big house music. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then the sound grew clearer. A piano, gentle and slow. Someone in the master's family was playing in the parlor. The kind of calm, delicate tune meant to soothe the nerves of white guests or entertain the ladies after dinner. A pretty sound floating out through windows trimmed with gold curtains. I stared at the wall with my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. That piano, those soft notes, they felt like knives. How could there be beauty in that house, while Ruth sat beside me fighting back tears she could no longer swallow? How could things be so easy in those rooms, while everything inside ours was falling apart? That contrast, the music and her trembling, lit something in me. Not a spark, not a flare, a fuse. I didn't realize it yet, but the fuse was burning. When Graham knocked on the cabin door, I damn near jumped out of my skin. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft taps, polite as always, almost gentle, but we both knew the meaning behind them. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. Graham didn't push the door open. He never did. That was part of the cruelty, making us open the door ourselves, like volunteers in our own suffering. His voice came through the wood in that same low, almost apologetic tone he always used at times like this. "Master wants Ruth." Those words settled over the room like a burial cloth. Ruth didn't move right away. She pressed a hand over her mouth, squeezing her eyes shut as though she could block the world out. Her shoulders rose and fell with uneven breath. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought I could hear it echoing through the cabin walls. "Ruth," I whispered, reaching for her hand. She didn't take it. Her fingers slipped away from mine, and I felt something break inside my chest. Quiet but final, like the last plank of a collapsing bridge snapping under weight. She stood up slowly, her movements stiff, mechanical. I saw the moment she forced her face into that expression she wore for the big house. Blank, empty, already halfway gone inside. I hated that look. I hated what it meant. I hated what it did to her. She moved toward the door with small, hesitant step. I rose to follow her, not because I could stop anything, but because I couldn't watch her walk into that night alone. But before I reached the doorway, Ruth paused. She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see the profile of her cheek. She didn't look me full in the face. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she feared if she did, she'd fall apart and couldn't gather the pieces again. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Those 2 words were like cold water thrown over a fire. Shocking, painful, waking something I'd been trying to keep asleep. I shook my head, my voice cracking. "Don't say that. You ain't got nothing to be sorry for." But she did not respond. She opened the door, stepped out, and for a moment Graham's lantern light flickered across her face. Then the door closed behind her, and I was left staring at a wall that suddenly felt too close, too tight, like the cabin was shrinking around me. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, hours, Time didn't move in seconds anymore. It moved in heartbeats and breaths and screams. Because tonight, unlike the other nights, she screamed. Not muffled crying, not quiet sobbing. A scream of pure terror that came tearing down from the big house like a storm wind. My body reacted before my mind did. I shot to my feet so fast I nearly knocked over the lantern. The room swayed around me, and I had to steady myself on the table. The scream came again. Higher, sharper, like something inside her had torn. My vision flickered red. I stumbled out of the cabin and into the yard, the night air hitting me like a slap. The moon was bright overhead, shining down on the path to the big house like it was guiding me. The fields behind the quarters rustled with night wind, but everything else was still. Too still. I walked at first, not because I meant to, but because shock held me upright like some invisible force was dragging me forward. The grass brushed against my leg. Gravel crunched under my feet. I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else. But when I reached the base of the hill and heard Ruth's third scream, something inside me snapped. Clean, sharp, irreversible. I ran. My feet hit the ground harder than I expected. The world blurred. My breath came fast. My ribs ached. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. It felt like I had been tied to the sound of her pain, and it was dragging me up that hill with a strength I didn't know I had. Before I realized it, I was standing at the front steps of the big house. A place I had never set foot on without being summoned like an animal. My chest was heaving, sweat dripped down my temples. The lantern above the door swung in the wind, creaking faintly. Inside voices were shouting. One of them was Whitfield's. I moved toward the door as though in a dream. My hand was reaching out before I even knew what it was reaching for. The door wasn't locked. It swung open with a soft groan that sounded almost surprised. The entry hall glowed with warm lamplight. The piano music had stopped. The air smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and something sharp. Fear, maybe. Mine, or hers, or his. I heard a thud upstairs, a cry, and then his voice low and furious. Don't you dare scream in my house. I climbed the stairs without thinking. Each step felt like an eternity. Each step felt like a choice I couldn't undo. I reached the hallway, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The door to Whitfield's private parlor was half open. Light spilled out onto the floorboards. I could hear him breathing, heavy, angry. Ruth's voice trembled. Please, please don't. And that was it. That was the end of the man I used to be. I pushed the door open. Whitfield spun around so fast he almost dropped the bottle in his hand. His face twisted with disbelief and rage. His other hand was gripping Ruth's arm so hard her skin was turning white around his fingers. Her dress was torn at the shoulder again. Tears streaked her face. What in God's name do you think you're doing here? He snarled. I don't remember deciding to speak. The words came out of me like breath, like truth, like fire catching dry grass. Let her go. Everything went silent. Whitfield froze. Ruth stopped breathing. Even the lantern flame on his desk seemed to pause. He stared at me as though I were some kind of animal that had suddenly begun speaking human language. Then his expression twisted into something darker. Something I had seen before only a few times. The look a man gives right before he decides to kill. What did you say to me? He growled. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, but I didn't look away. I repeated, my voice steady for the first time in months. Let her go in that moment. That impossible, suicidal moment. Something profound shifted inside me. For the first time in my life, I was not obeying. I was not bending. I was not surviving. I was standing. Whitfield's hand went to the pistol at his belt. Ruth gasped. And in the silence that followed, in the single heartbeat before the world exploded, I felt something, freedom. Terrifying. Small, flickering, but real. And nothing, not chains, not fear, not even death, was going to put that feeling back in its box again. When Whitfield's pistol came up, I thought that was the end. Truly, I did. I had imagined my death many times before. Hanging from a branch, bleeding out under the overseer's whip, collapsing in the fields from sunstroke. But never like this, never standing between my wife and the man who owned us both. And yet, as the barrel leveled at my chest, I felt something strange. Not fear, not even courage, but a kind of quiet acceptance. If I died here, at least my last act would mean something. At least it would not be silence. But death didn't come. Ruth moved first. Before Whitfield could fire, she threw herself between us with a cry I had never heard from her before. Not terror, not despair, but something rawer. something like desperation mixed with defiance. Her arms spread wide, shielding me with a body that had already suffered too much. "Please," she cried. "Please, Master Whitfield. He didn't mean it. He's just tired, he's confused. Please don't him." The pistol wavered. Just an inch, but Whitfield lowered it slightly. Not because he had mercy, but because he saw something better than killing me quickly. The chance to make a spectacle of my defiance. The chance to break me in front of her, in front of everyone. His eyes narrowed. "Oh, I'll deal with him," he said, voice low and venomous. "But not with a bullet. A bullet is too quick and too merciful." He stepped toward me, holstering the pistol and reaching instead for the riding crop on the table beside him. The same whip he used on horses, with a polished wooden handle and braided leather tip. A whip that had drawn blood from dozens of backs over the years. "Move," he snarled at Ruth. But she didn't. She stood firm, her chest rising and falling wildly, tears streaking down her face but her spine straight. For a moment, just a moment, I saw the woman I married, the woman who once dared to dream of freedom. Whitfield stared at her, stunned that she would defy him even this much. His jaw clenched, and without warning, he grabbed her by the arm and flung her aside. She hit the floor hard, her cry echoing off the walls. That sound ignited something in me. Not anger. Anger I had felt for months. Not hatred. Hatred I had carried since the first night he laid hands on her. No, what rose inside me then was something deeper. Born from the core of my being, resolve. He swung the crop before I could move. Pain exploded across my shoulder, white hot, tearing a shout from my mouth before I could stop it. He hit me again, then again. Each strike was a question he demanded. I answer. Who owns you? Who owns your wife? Who decides your fate? Each strike was meant to pull my spirit apart. But instead, each one hardened something inside me. He beat me until my knees buckled and I collapsed onto the floor. He struck me across the back, the ribs, the arms. Anywhere he could reach. I gripped the floorboard so tightly my nails tore. But through the haze of agony, I heard Ruth's voice crying my name. That kept me conscious. That kept me alive. Whitfield's breath grew heavy as he swung the whip with rising fury. When he grew tired, he stepped back, chest heaving, face red with sweat and rage. Tomorrow morning, he panted. You'll be chained to the whipping post. You'll take 50 lashes in front of everyone. And after that, he glanced at Ruth with a cruel smile. Maybe I'll sell her downriver, teach you both your place. He turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Silence followed, so thick it felt like a second darkness in the room. Ruth crawled to my side, her hands trembling as she touched the welts forming on my back and arms. Why? She whispered, her voice breaking. Why did you speak? Why did you do that? They'll kill you. They'll kill us both. I forced myself to sit up, every muscle screaming. My breath came in ragged gasps. Blood trickled down my side. But I lifted her chin with a shaking hand so she would look at me. Because, I said, barely able to speak, some things you can't keep swallowing. Some things break a man so deep, he'll die standing before he'll live kneeling. She pressed her forehead to mine, sobbing softly. Then what do we do? Isaiah, what do we do? For the first time in my life, I didn't have an answer ready. All my life survival had required obedience, endurance, silence, but survival was no longer. Not when every day meant watching Ruth dragged to that house. Not when every breath she took was a reminder that we were trapped in a nightmare with no waking. What was left to lose? I looked around the room. Whitfield's private parlor, fancy furniture polished to shine. Pictures of horses and hunting scenes on the walls, books in glass cases, a silver decanter half full on the table, a lantern burning bright near the window. A lantern, a small thing, but fire does not care how small it starts. An idea flickered at the edge of my mind. A dangerous idea, a final idea. Ruth saw something change in my face. Isaiah, what are you thinking? I didn't answer. Not yet. The thought forming in me was too wild, too impossible, too full of death and truth. But it grew anyway. Whitfield had crossed the last line inside me. He had shown Ruth there was no future but pain. He had shown me that survival was no longer worth the cost. For the first time since I was a boy, sitting in a wagon after my mother was sold, I let myself imagine the world without Whitfield in it. I imagined silence instead of screams. I imagined freedom instead of fear. I imagined fire where his house stood. I imagined ending him before he ended us. Not running. Not begging, not surrendering. Fighting, destroying and burning. My heartbeat slowed. My shaking steadied. The pain in my body faded into a background roar. The idea rooted itself firmly, undeniably in my mind. If he was going to kill me tomorrow, I would not meet death on my knees. I would meet it with a match in my hand. I turned to Ruth, brushing her tears away with my thumb. "Listen to me," I said, voice low but steady. "Tomorrow they'll whip me, they'll try to break me. And if I bend, they'll sell you away and I'll never see you again." She nodded through tears. "So we don't wait for morning," I said. "We leave, tonight." She stared at me in confusion, fear, and something else. Hope trying to spark again inside her chest. "But the dogs," she whispered. "The patrols, the hunters. We can't outrun them." I shook my head slowly. "I ain't trying to outrun them." She frowned. "Then what?" I leaned close. "We burn this place," I breathed. "Burn the fields, the barns, the house, everything. And in the chaos we run." Ruth froze. She didn't breathe for a long moment. Her eyes widened as the meaning sank in. The horror, the danger, the possibility. "You're talking about killing him," she whispered. My voice did not shake. "I'm talking about ending the man who ended us." She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had changed. She wasn't the ghost she'd been for months. She was Ruth again, the woman who once hummed while cooking, who smiled under the pecan tree, who jumped the broom with hope in her eyes. "You'll die," she said quietly. I nodded. "Maybe, and maybe not. But either way, I won't die begging." Silence fell between us, heavy, electric, final. Then Ruth took my hand, slowly but firmly, and squeezed it. "Then I run with you," she whispered. "Wherever you go." I felt tears sting my eyes, something I hadn't felt in years. Not tears of fear, not tears of weakness, tears of resolve. Because in that moment the decision was made not by rage, not by fear, but by love. Tonight, Whitfield Plantation would become what it had always been beneath the surface. A place of smoke, a place of screams, a place built on fire. The only difference was that this time the fire would be out. The night I chose fire over breath did not arrive with thunder or warning. It came quietly as most revolutions do, slipping in through cracks of exhaustion and despair, settling into a man's bones like a truth he can't outrun anymore. The moon hung high above Whitfield Plantation, a pale, watchful eye, its light stretching like a silver blade across the yard. Everything looked so calm from the outside, so peaceful, a world wrapped in stillness. But inside me a storm raged. My back burned with every movement, the welts from Whitfield's beating swollen and raw. I could barely lift my arms without shaking. My vision blurred if I turned too quickly. Yet somehow that pain made everything clearer, sharper. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. Ruth was kneeling beside me in our cabin, hands trembling as she tied strips of cloth around my wound. She worked in silence, her brow furrowed with fear and resolve. The lantern's small flame cast shadows across her face, making her look older and younger all at once. Like the girl I fell in love with, and the woman hardened by pain living inside the same fragile frame. "You should," she whispered when she finished, her voice thin as a thread. "Once we start, there ain't no going back." I nodded. "Ain't nothing left behind us worth going back to." She closed her eyes at that, pressing her forehead to my shoulder. I pulled her close, careful not to wince at the pain, and held her like I was afraid the night would steal her from me before dawn could try. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Minutes, maybe an hour. The cabin was silent except for our breathing and the faint rustle of wind through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the quarters slept. Exhausted bodies collapsed on straw pallets after another day of forced labor. They had no idea what was coming. I rose slowly, breath gritted through my teeth, and reached for the only thing I owned, a small carving knife I kept hidden under the floorboard. It wasn't much, more tool than weapon. But a man doesn't need much steel when he's carrying a lifetime of fire inside it. Ruth climbed to her feet behind me. Her hand shook, but not from fear alone. She was gripping hers too tightly, trying to steady the racing of her own heart. "Stay close," I whispered. "Move quiet. And if anything happens," she cut me off, her voice firmer than I had heard in months. "If you fall, I fall too." I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since Whitfield laid claim to her, I saw the strength still burning deep beneath the ash. It steadied me more than any plan could. We stepped out into the night. The air was humid, thick with the scent of pine and distant rain. The moon cast long shadows between the cabins, the kind that make it hard to tell friend from threat. But I knew this place. I knew its rhythms, its blind spots, its weaknesses. Whitfield built a kingdom of fear, but fear makes men careless in the things they take for granted. and I had spent 22 years studying every inch of that carelessness. We moved along the shadows, sticking close to the tree line behind the quarters. Ruth clung to my arm, her breath quiet and steady. Every chirp, every rustle, every crack of distant branches felt like a footstep behind us. But no one stirred. Not at first. The first stop was the stables. Every plantation depended on its horse. They were the master's pride, the overseer's legs, the patrol's hounds made faster. I had no intention of letting Whitfield send men after us before the fire even reached his doorstep. The stable door creaked softly when I pushed it open. I froze, breath caught in my chest. Ruth squeezed my hand. No one came. Inside, the horses shifted restlessly, sensing something was wrong. They snorted, stamped their hooves, tails flicking at the humid air. I reached into the pocket of my pants and pulled out the small pouch of nails I'd stolen from the blacksmith's shed that afternoon, hiding them under a water trough when no one was looking. One by one, I slipped the nails into the horseshoes, sharp side pointing down so they'd drive into the earth with the next gallop. Crippling a horse was cruel, but so was the world that forced me to choose between sparing animals and protecting the woman I loved. If Whitfield's men couldn't ride, they couldn't chase. From the stable, we moved to the barn. The big barn was old, its beams dry from summers of relentless heat, stuffed to bursting with hay and tobacco. A match in the wrong place would turn it into a beacon no one on the plantation could ignore. I knew exactly where that wrong place was. Ruth stood guard as I slipped inside. The darkness swallowed me whole, smelling of hay and sweat and the faint sting of old smoke from lanterns long burned out. My hand shook as I opened the lantern I'd hidden earlier behind a stack of crates. I'd left it there 2 days ago, back when this plan had been nothing more than a whisper of anger in the back of my mind. I struck the flint. The small flame flickered, then steadied. I breathed deeply, then I tipped the lantern into the hay. It caught immediately. Fire does not wait for permission once it knows it can grow. Flames licked up the dry stalks as though starved for years, turning gold to orange, orange to blistering red. The crackle started low, then grew, whispering, then murmuring, then roaring as it began to climb. I didn't wait to watch. I grabbed the lantern's handle, now empty, and darted back outside where Ruth stood pale under the moonlight. She saw the glow rising behind me, and a soft gasp escaped her. "Isaiah," I took her hand. "We ain't got time. It's startin'." We ran. Not far. Just along the side of the barn, keeping low in the shadows. The fire grew quickly, more quickly than I expected. Within moments it was a living thing, climbing the beams, breathing smoke, reaching hungry arms toward the roof. Night wind carried embers toward the fields, bright sparks drifting like stars ripped from their places. A shout cut through the silence, then another, then a third. Doors opened in the quarters. People stumbled out half asleep, eyes wide with terror as they saw the flames. Men cursed. Women screamed. Children cried. The overseer's voice rang out from somewhere near the front yard. "Bucket line, move, damn you, move." Ruth gripped my arm. "They know. Isaiah, they know something's wrong. They know the barn is burning," I said quietly. "They don't know we're next." Ducked behind the smokehouse, hearts pounding, as more men rushed toward the fire, hauling water buckets, shouting orders, stumbling in confusion. The barn's roof collapsed in a spray of sparks that lit up half the yard like sunrise, and in the chaos, no one looked for us. No one saw the two shadows slipping away behind the cookhouse, toward the rear side of the big house, toward the place the fire was meant to finish what Whitfield started. As we crept through the dark, Ruth whispered, "Isaiah, the others, they don't know what's happening. Are we bringing danger to them?" I swallowed hard. Truth was heavy. "I ain't starting war with them, Ruth. I'm starting it with him." She nodded, though fear still trembled in her eyes. We reached the back steps of the big house, the kitchen entrance where servants came and went. I knew this door. Knew it because Ruth had walked through it too many times. Because her suffering lived behind it. Tonight something else would. The kitchen was dark when we entered. Pots hung from rafters like silent witnesses. The smell of leftover stew lingered in the air. The hearth glowed faintly, embers still alive from cooking earlier. I walked to the hearth, picked up the burning log from inside, turned to Ruth. "This is where it starts," I whispered. Her eyes shimmered, not with fear, but with the beginning of hope. Kind of hope that rises in the same breath as destruction. The fire in my hand crackled. The fire behind us roared. The shouts grew louder. The night grew hotter. Whitfield Plantation was waking to its own nightmare, and we were not done yet, not by a long shot. If hell had a doorway in Mississippi, It was the back kitchen entrance of the Whitfield big house on the night I walked through it with a burning log in my hand. The handle was warm from my grip, the fire's heat crawling up my wrist like a living thing hungry for more. The kitchen smelled of grease and onions and something faintly sweet, remnants of whatever dinner had been served to Whitfield and his sons hours before. Yet beneath that I smelled something sharper, something that crackled in my nose and settled on my tongue. Smoke. Not the smoke from the barn behind us. This was older, trapped in the walls, lingering from 100 winters of wood fires. It was a ghost scent, mingling with the shadows as if the house itself had been waiting all these years to burn. Ruth stood at the door behind me, her breath fast and trembling. The glow from the burning barn seeped through the windows, flickering across her face and turning her eyes into two shining mirrors of the flames outside. She looked terrified, but not with the terror of helplessness. This was something else, something sharper, something that lived just beneath the surface of her fear. Purpose. "Isaiah," she whispered, reaching for my arm. "It's not too late to just run. We could slip into the woods, follow the creek north, and Whitfield will hunt us," I finished quietly. "He'll chase us till the ends of the earth if he has to. You know that." Her hand dropped slowly. I stepped deeper into the kitchen. Every sound felt too loud. The thud of my heart, the soft scrape of my boots against the floorboards, the faint hiss of the burning log. But the house was empty, silent. Everyone had rushed to the barn, to the fire growing too fast for them to understand. That was the gift fire always gave: confusion. I crossed the kitchen and set the burning log into the pile of kindlings stacked beside the stove. The dry wood caught instantly, a soft whoosh filling the space as flames leapt hungrily upward. The fire licked up the side of the stove, swallowed the kindling, and began crawling along the baseboards like a creature tasting freedom. "Come on," I whispered to Ruth, taking her hand. "We ain't done yet." We slipped out of the kitchen and into the back hallway. The floors here were polished, smooth from generations of boots and heels. My own reflection warped in the shine of the wood, the face of a man who had already crossed a point of no return. Up ahead, the stairs loomed in the dim light, and at their top I could see a glimmer, the faintest sliver of lamplight spilling from Whitfield's study. I froze. That room, that was where he had dragged Ruth, where he had struck her, where he had beaten me, whip cracking across my flesh, where he had threatened to sell her, where every bit of this nightmare had taken shape. The shouting outside grew louder. Someone yelled, "Fire's spreadin', get more water!" Another voice barked orders. A horse screamed. Ruth squeezed my hand. "We have to hurry." I nodded, swallowing hard. The plan wasn't finished. Not until Whitfield was finished. We moved quickly up the stairs, each step creaking beneath our feet, the sound lost beneath the mounting chaos outside. As I reached the landing, I heard it. Footsteps, a door opening. A man swore loudly. Whitfield's eldest son, from the sound of it. "Damn smoke's comin' in the windows. Close the shutters, we need Pa." Another voice. Robert, the younger son. My pulse shot through my veins like lightning. Ruth tugged my sleeve. "We can go around, down the servants' stairs." "No." She stared at me like I'd spoken in a language she didn't understand. "I'm ending this," I said, my voice low, steady, terrifyingly calm. "Tonight." Ruth looked at my face, searching for hesitation. She found none. She closed her eyes for one heartbeat, then opened them. "I'm with you." We stepped into the main hallway, and there he was. He was shouting at his sons, pointing toward the window as if ordering them to stop the smoke from entering was enough to change the wind itself. He turned and saw us. The moment his eyes met mine, the world narrowed to a single point of frozen silence. His face twisted from confusion to disbelief to rage in the space of a single breath. "You," he spat. "How the hell?" I didn't wait for him to finish. I lunged, the force of my body slamming into his sent us both crashing into the study. Papers scattered. A lamp toppled. Whitfield shouted, punching wildly, his fists slamming into my ribs, my back, my jaw. Pain burst through me with each blow, but adrenaline swallowed it whole. I grabbed him by the throat, fingers digging into the soft flesh beneath his jaw. "You ain't ever gonna touch her again," I growled through clenched teeth. He choked, tried to claw at my hands, eyes bulging with fury and something else. The fear of a man who believed himself immortal until the moment mortality grabbed him by the neck. Behind me, I heard Ruth cry my name, but I couldn't look away, couldn't ease up, Couldn't give this man 1 inch of breath more than he deserved. Whitfield managed to land a punch against my temple that sent stars exploding behind my eyes. My grip loosened. He shoved me backward, gasping, reaching for the pistol lying on his desk. "No!" Ruth screamed. I lunged first. I grabbed the pistol before his fingers could close around the grip. My hand shook so violently I nearly dropped it. I had never held a gun in my life, never even touched one. But there was no question what had to happen. Whitfield froze, not in fear, in outrage. "How dare you?" he snarled. "You think you're a man? You think you can threaten me? I own you." "You don't own nothing," I whispered. "Not anymore." He took one furious step toward me. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot exploded like a cannon in the small room. The recoil knocked me backward. Smoke and the sharp scent of gunpowder filled the air. Whitfield staggered, a red bloom spreading across his shirt. His son shouted outside the door. Ruth covered her mouth with both hands. Whitfield fell to his knees. Then he fell forward, face down on the polished floor, dead. I stared at his body, chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. My hand shook violently. The pistol slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. Ruth rushed forward and grabbed me. The world spun around us. Shouts echoing from outside, smoke crawling under the study door, flames beginning to lick at the hallway walls. "We have to go," she whispered urgently. "Isaiah, we have to run now." But I couldn't look away from the body, from the man who had owned my life, owned my wife, owned my pain. Until now, a lifetime of fear melted from my bones in a single exhale. "I did it," I whispered. Ruth cupped my face with shaking hands. "We have to move or we die here with him. Look, the fire's inside the house." She was right. Smoke curled along the ceiling. The heat rose. Voices outside grew frantic. Someone screamed, "The fire's in the kitchen. It's coming fast." I grabbed Ruth's hand. We ran down the hallway, down the stairs, through the smoke-filled kitchen, past the flames climbing the walls. Every breath burned. Every step felt like walking through a nightmare. Behind us, the house began to roar as fire found the curtains, the wallpaper, the beams, every dry inch of Whitfield's legacy. We burst out into the night air, coughing, half-blind, stumbling down the steps as the flames shot through the windows behind us. The big house was burning. The barn was burning. The yard was chaos, slaves running in every direction, overseers shouting, the sons screaming for water. But none of them saw us slip into the shadows at the edge of the trees. None of them saw the 2 figures disappearing into the night, hand in hand. None of them knew that the man who had set their world on fire had already taken his first steps toward freedom. Or death, whichever came first. Behind us, Whitfield Plantation groaned as flames devoured its bones. And somewhere deep inside me, a lifetime of chains began to crack. The smoke from the big house rose like a dark column into the sky, swallowing the moon in a choking veil of ash. The night air, once thick with humidity, turned sharp with fire. Each breath scraped my throat like I was inhaling burning sand. But none of that mattered. Whitfield was dead. The house was burning, and Ruth's hand was in mine as we plunged into the tree line behind the quarters. The forest swallowed us whole, its shadows offering the kind of protection no man had ever given us. Branches clawed at our clothes, roots snagged our feet, but adrenaline drove our bodies forward faster than reason could warn us to slow down. Behind us, the plantation we had known our entire lives was collapsing into chaos. Cries of panic echoed through the yard. "Horses! Somebody get the damn horses! The fire's spreading. Where's Master Whitfield? Where the hell is he? Get the water lines! Smoke's too thick. Cover your mouths." But the most important cry, the one I strained to hear above all others, never came. No one shouted my name. No one screamed, "They're running, not yet." We had minutes, maybe less. Ruth stumbled on a tangle of vines, nearly falling. I caught her, bracing her with one arm. "Keep going," I whispered, brushing soot from her cheek. Just a little further. She nodded, breath trembling, eyes wide with terror and something else. Something like hope and horror blended together. The forest around us was thick with night sounds. Cicadas buzzing, distant owls calling, leaves shifting as small creatures fled from the spreading smoke. The fire had sparked panic among everything with a pulse. Even the trees seemed to tremble. Branches snapped under our feet as we ran deeper. Sweat stung the cuts on my back. My shirt, already torn from Whitfield's beating, clung to me like a second skin soaked in blood and soot. My muscles screamed. My ribs felt cracked. Each movement sent lightning bolts of pain through my spine. But I pushed on. Pain was nothing. Pain was nothing. Pain was freedom compared to where we'd been. When we reached a fallen log near a shallow stream, I pulled Ruth behind it and crouched low. The stream's trickle masked some of the noise from the plantation. We lay there for a moment, gasping, listening. Ruth broke the silence first. "Isaiah," she swallowed hard. "What if they catch us? The sons, they've got guns. And that patrol captain, they ain't catching us tonight," I said firmly. "But tomorrow?" I looked at her, at the way her hands trembled against the dirt, at the tear tracks cutting clean lines through the soot on her cheeks. "We don't think about tomorrow," I murmured, brushing her cheek with the backs of my fingers. "Tonight is all we got. Tonight is enough." Her breath hitched. She closed her eyes and leaned into my touch. The forest glowed faintly orange as the fire consumed the big house. Sparks drifted upward like lost souls rising. The distant crackle of flame sounded like applause. Applause for a man finally breaking his chains. For a moment, a short, fragile one, we sat there watching the world we knew turn to ash. But the moment didn't last. A scream from the plantation cut through the night. "They're gone. The slaves are saying the boy's gone, they ain't finding him nowhere." Another voice shouted louder and angrier, "Find him! Find both of them!" The search had begun. Ruth's eyes flew open in terror. "Isaiah, I know," I said, rising to my knees. "Time to move." We followed the stream north, the direction Benjamin had whispered to me about years ago in hushed tones. The path rumored to lead toward friendly farms, safe houses, the earliest fingers of the Underground Railroad stretching through Mississippi like hidden veins. The moon guided us when the trees parted enough to let its light through. When the canopy grew thick, the darkness swallowed us, and I had to navigate by memory and instinct, trusting the ground beneath my feet and the faint gurgle of the water. Hours passed, hours that felt like days. Our footsteps grew heavier. The adrenaline faded, replaced by exhaustion so deep it threatened to pull us down like quicksand. My wounds throbbed, sticky with dried blood. Each breath was a battle. Ruth touched my arm gently as we reached a cluster of pine trees forming a natural shelter. "We need to rest," she whispered. Just for a moment, I wanted to keep going. Every instinct in me screamed that stopping meant death. But her face was pale, and she was trembling from more than fear. I nodded reluctantly. "Just a little." Just to gather ourselves, we settled beneath the pines. The needles muffled our footsteps and cushioned the hard earth beneath us. The wind rattled the branches overhead. Somewhere far away, dogs barked, faint but real. Ruth's eyes snapped open at the sound. "They've set the hounds on us." "Dogs'll lose our scent once we hit the creek proper," I reassured her. "Just need to make it that far." "But you're back, Isaiah. You can barely stay upright. You're bleeding through your shirt." I managed a tired smile. "Ain't nothing new." She reached for my face, tracing the bruises forming along my jaw. Her touch was soft, trembling. "You did it," she whispered. "You killed him." "Yeah," I breathed, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, I did for a moment. Just a moment." The fear in her eyes softened into something else, something like peace. She leaned her head on my shoulder. I rested my cheek against her hair. We sat like that, two broken souls holding each other together, while the world behind us burned. But the dogs grew louder. Voices followed, muffled, distant, but drawing closer. "We gotta go," I whispered against her hair. "Now." She rose first, offering me her hand. I took it and forced myself to my feet. Pain ripped through me, but I kept my face steady. She needed strength. I couldn't show her how close to breaking I was. We moved through the trees again, our bodies shadows among shadows. The stream widened into the creek Benjamin once told me about, its waters dark and swift. Cold wrapped around my ankles as I stepped in, sending a tremor up my spine. Ruth followed. The sound of the dogs shifted. They'd lost the trail, just as I'd hoped. But the men were still coming. We trudged through the creek, the water masking our scent, carrying away the traces of our passage. The moon glimmered off the surface like shattered glass. My limbs felt heavy, as though the creek was trying to pull me under. Ruth slipped once, nearly falling, but I caught her by the wrist. "You all right?" She nodded. "Just tired." "We'll be out of this soon," I lied gently. By dawn, the sky began to lighten, the horizon washing pale blue. Birds stirred, chirping sleepily. The fire behind us had dimmed, but the smoke trail still rose like a black spine into the morning air. We finally stepped out of the creek onto muddy ground. My legs nearly buckled, but Ruth held me up. The forest here was quiet, eerily so. For the first time since we fled, no shouts echoed through the trees. We lost them. Ruth whispered, more prayer than fact. Maybe, I said, or maybe fate's given us a head start. She stared at me with wide eyes. Where do we go now? North, I said simply. Just north, just north. Far as our feet'll take us, far as the good Lord'll grant us. Ruth nodded slowly, then took my hand. We'll make it, she said, with a conviction I didn't recognize. Strong, fierce, we didn't come this far to die now. I squeezed her fingers. No, I whispered, we didn't. Behind us, Whitfield Plantation lay in ruins, a graveyard of greed and cruelty burned down to its bone. Ahead of us stretched a forest that held a future we didn't know, a path we couldn't see, a hope as fragile as a candle flame in a storm. Between the ashes and the unknown, all we had was each other. And the road out, we stepped forward together, leaving the smoke behind. And with every footfall, every breath of cold morning air, every tremor of fear and flicker of hope, I felt something loosening inside me. Chains, one by one, breaking. Morning came slowly, pale and uncertain, as though the sun itself wasn't sure it wanted to rise on the world we'd just remade through fire and blood. Light sifted through the trees in thin beams, touching the forest floor in trembling gold patches. Dew clung to every blade of grass. The air was cool, a sharp contrast to the heat of the burning plantation behind us. And for the first time in my 32 years of breath on this earth, the day didn't begin with a whip cracking in the distance or someone shouting orders over the fields. It began with silence, cold, delicate silence that settled over the woods like a blessing. Ruth stood beside me on the muddy bank, her dress clinging to her legs, her hair damp from creek water. Her eyes were swollen from smoke and tears, but when she looked at me, there was something new in them, something fierce, something alive. For months I'd watched the light fade from her, stolen night after night by Whitfield's cruelty, but now in that fragile dawn I saw it flicker back. Weak, yes, barely there, but real. Isaiah, she whispered. Look, she gestured toward the horizon. Through gaps in the trees, I could just barely make out a faint orange glow, still curling upward like a dying ember. Whitfield Plantation, our prison, our torment, the place that shaped and broke and twisted the lives of hundreds, was collapsing into ashes. Smoke rose into the sky like the spirit of the land finally being released. Ruth's hand slipped into mine. It's gone, she breathed. All of it, I exhaled. Not all. Some things don't burn easy. I touched the scars on my back, ridges of fire beneath my torn shirt. They throbbed with every breath, a reminder of what we had survived. A reminder of what we could never fully outrun. Ruth stepped closer, sliding her fingers gently across the shreds of my shirt, her touch careful, almost reverent. We'll mend what can be mended, she whispered, and what can't we carry? I nodded slowly. It was the truest thing anyone had ever said to me. We walked for hours that morning, following the creek north through tangled underbrush and overfallen branches. The forest slowly shifted, pines giving way to thicker oak and maple, the ground rising cautiously toward higher land. Birds began to call overhead, their songs strange after years of waking to shouts and chains. Small animals darted across our path, unbothered by our presence, treating us like any other creature moving through their world. Freedom tasted strange, like we didn't quite know how to swallow it. My legs shook with every step. The beating Whitfield gave me before his end had torn muscles and opened deep wounds. Every breath felt like it scraped through broken ribs. Ruth watched me carefully, offering her arm whenever I stumbled. Lean on me, she insisted. Ain't no shame in that. There is if it slows us, I muttered, trying to hide a grimace. She stopped walking and turned to me, gripping my chin so I had to look at her. We ain't slaves no more, Isaiah, she said firmly. We walked together. Those words hit me harder than any whip ever had. We walked slower after that, but we walked together. By midday, we came across traces of an old path. Not a road, not a trail, just a place where the earth looked slightly more worn, where grass bent more easily, where a man or woman might have traveled before. Ruth knelt and touched the dirt. Someone's been this way recently. How can you tell? She pointed to a faint footprint. Small, probably a woman. The edges weren't sharp, which meant it wasn't fresh, maybe a day or two old, but it was real. A path someone had dared to take, a path that might lead to others like us. Do you think it's safe? She asked quietly. Safer than going back? I answered. We followed that faint path deeper into the forest. Birds scattered as we passed. My stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder that our last meal had been more than a day ago. We'll find something, I said, trying to sound confident. Ruth lowered her head. There's berries deeper in the woods. Old Lottie used to show me which ones won't kill you. I smiled a little despite the pain. Then lead the way, And an hour later, near a patch of wild bramble, Ruth plucked dark berries and handed me a handful. They ain't sweet, she warned, but they'll keep us walking. They tasted bitter, but life has taught me bitter things. Often keep a man alive longer than sweet ones. As I ate, Ruth cleaned the wounds on my back with cool creek water, tearing strips from her dress to replace the blood-soaked rags. Tears shined in her eyes as she worked, but her hand stayed steady. Hurts? She asked softly. Yes, I admitted. She nodded once. Good. Means you ain't dead. Her attempt at humor cracked my chest open with a small, painful laugh. By late afternoon, the trees thinned, and the sound of rushing water grew loud. We came to a wider river, a barrier and a blessing. The current wasn't strong, but the water was deep and cold. Logs and debris floated past with the steady pull of the river's flow. Ruth stared at it nervously. We cross here? We have to, I said. Dogs lose trails fast in water. If the hounds start again, this'll throw 'em for good. She looked down at her trembling hands. But with your back, I'll manage. She didn't argue. We stepped in together. The water reached our knees, then our waists, then our chests. The shock of cold stole my breath. When I lifted my arms to swim, agony ripped through my back so sharply I almost sank. Ruth shouted my name and grabbed me, shoving her shoulder under mine. I got you, she cried. Just kick, don't stop. Every stroke felt like fire exploding inside my body. My arms barely moved. The river pulled at me, hungry. But Ruth held on. She kicked for the both of us. When we finally reached the opposite bank, we collapsed in the mud, coughing and shaking. The world spun, my vision blurred. For a moment, darkness pressed in around the edges. Ruth slapped my cheek lightly. Isaiah, stay with me. I blinked hard. I'm here. She sagged with relief. We lay there side by side, soaked and exhausted, while the river carried pieces of our old lives away. We built a small shelter that night. A lean-to made of branches and leaves, enough to hide us from passing eyes and shield us from cold night air. Ruth curled against me beneath the makeshift roof, her head on my shoulder, her breath warm against my collarbone. Do you think they'll be coming for us still? She whispered. Whitfield's sons. Maybe. Then what do we do? I stared at the sliver of moon visible through the branches. What did we do? We had no map, no guide, no promise that the Underground Railroad would appear when we needed it, no guarantee that every white face we met wouldn't turn us in for reward money. But we had fire behind us and the North Star ahead. We move, I said softly, every night, every day. We keep our heads down. We keep close to water, close to cover. And when we find someone who knows the road, we trust him. She nodded against my chest. And if we don't, then we keep walking anyway. She closed her eye. The forest hummed around us. Crickets singing, leaves rustling, the river murmuring like an old storyteller whispering secrets. For the first time since childhood, I didn't fall asleep afraid of being woken by violence. I fell asleep afraid of not waking up beside her. When dawn broke again, we rose and started walking. And as the trees parted and a new stretch of land opened before us, a land neither of us had ever seen, I felt something shift inside me. Fear was still there, heavy in my stomach. Pain walked with me like a shadow. But beneath both, something else stirred. Something daring, something stubborn, something like hope. Because every step away from Whitfield was a step toward becoming something more than what he'd forced us to be. Every mile north was a mile toward a world that might allow us to build a life instead of surviving one. And with Ruth's hand in mine, the impossible suddenly felt almost within reach. We did not know where the road led, but for the first time in our lives, the road belonged to us.